The slight tremor in Dr. Eris Thorne's hand wasn't from the air conditioning, excessively chilled as it was in the cavernous belly of the convention center. It was the program, its glossy paper crinkling almost imperceptibly as her fingers tightened. Her name, when she finally located it after a prolonged search, was nestled at the bottom of an afternoon breakout session, listed under miscellaneous topics, almost an afterthought. A polite cough from the stage manager, a man whose eyes had skated over her moments before with an appraisal that cataloged her more as an anomaly than a presenter, signaled it was nearly her turn. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across concrete, had followed her path from the registration desk to the shadowed wing. Hushed questions about her university, a small, historically black institution, muted suppositions about the novelty of her approach, even a thinly veiled jest, overheard from a passing cluster of bespoke suits, about affirmative action science. She carried the weight of those whispers, the sting of years of dismissive glances and funding rejections, onto the stage with her laptop bag, which held not just data, but the accumulated truth of her relentless, often solitary, journey. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe quiet genius always finds a way, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Her presence at the podium was a quiet defiance. She was acutely aware of the polished egos arrayed before her, the luminaries of medical research whose published papers were foundational texts, whose labs were endowed with sums that could fund her own modest research facility for decades. These were the gatekeepers, the arbiters of what constituted serious science. For years, her work, rooted in the often overlooked resilience of marginalized communities and inspired by ethnobotanical wisdom passed down from her grandmother, a community healer, had been met with a polite but firm wall of skepticism. It wasn't flashy. It didn't emerge from the hallowed halls of Ivy League institutions. Therefore, it was suspect. The current hardship wasn't just this moment of potential public scrutiny. It was the culmination of a professional life spent on the periphery, her strength consistently underestimated, her insights prematurely dismissed. But what happened next would change everything. Dr. Eris Thorne was a study in contained intensity. Her brilliance wasn't the flamboyant, attention-seeking kind. It was a deep, steady burn, honed by years of meticulous observation and relentless dedication. She'd earned her doctorate from a university that valued community impact over prestigious rankings, a choice that had immediately set her apart, and often behind, in the fiercely competitive world of medical research. Her focus was cellular regeneration, a field crowded with giants. But her approach was unique. It stemmed from an early fascination with her grandmother's remedies, traditional plant-based poultices that seemed to accelerate healing in ways modern medicine couldn't quite explain. This wasn't folklore to Eris. It was a clue, a starting point for rigorous scientific inquiry. She'd endured countless grant rejections, the feedback often subtly patronizing, questioning the seriousness of research inspired by folk traditions. Each rejection had been a small paper cut, bleeding a little more of her hope, yet stealing her resolve. Her quiet demeanor, often misinterpreted as timidity, was in reality a fortress of concentration, a space where she could dissect complex biological pathways and shield herself from the incessant, low-humming prejudice of the establishment. Her staunchest ally was Amani, a recent graduate, bright-eyed and brimming with an infectious belief in Eris's vision. Amani had joined her small lab a year prior, initially as an intern, but her quick mind and unwavering loyalty had soon made her indispensable. "They just don't see it yet, Dr. Thorne," Amani would often say, poring over imaging data that showed remarkable cellular activity. "But they will. This is too important." Imani's youthful optimism was a vital counterpoint to Eris's weary pragmatism. The opposing force, the antagonist in Eris's journey, wasn't a single individual but an entire system. The established medical hierarchy that favored incremental advances from well-known figures over potentially paradigm-shifting discoveries from outsiders. This system was personified, however, by men like Dr. Alastair Finch. Finch was a titan in the field, his lab lavishly funded, his pronouncements treated as gospel. Eris remembered vividly the first time she'd encountered his influence directly. It was at a grant review panel several years ago. She hadn't seen Finch himself, but his signature was prominent on the rejection letter for her initial proposal, the one that laid the groundwork for her current breakthrough. The feedback, penned by a junior associate but clearly reflecting Finch's dismissive stance, had questioned the fundamental scientific rigor and lack of conventional pathway engagement in her proposed study of plant-derived compounds. Now, as she scanned the conference hall before her session, she saw Finch himself holding court in the main auditorium lobby, a silver-haired, imposing figure surrounded by acolytes, his laughter booming. He hadn't even glanced at the schedule for the breakout rooms, she was sure. The conference itself, held in a glittering, impersonal edifice of glass and steel, felt a universe away from the cramped but vibrant community clinic where her lab was housed, a place where real human suffering and resilience were daily realities, not abstract data points. Imani's words echoed in her mind. Your data is undeniable, Dr. Thorne. They have to listen. Eris hoped she was right. The catalyst for Eris's unwavering decision to proceed, despite the chillingly familiar atmosphere of dismissal, came just moments before she was due to speak. While waiting in the wings, she overheard a fragment of conversation from two well-dressed attendees perusing the program. Thorne, from that community college place, isn't it? Probably some niche herbal study. Good for a coffee break, I suppose. The casual cruelty of it, the easy assumption of her insignificance, lanced through Eris. It wasn't just about her. It was about every overlooked student, every underfunded lab, every unconventional idea that was stifled before it had a chance to breathe. A familiar wave of doubt washed over her, the urge to retreat, to simply upload her slides to the conference server and disappear. But then, a different image surfaced, her grandmother's knowing eyes, the quiet dignity of patients at the clinic whose chronic wounds had shown little improvement under standard care, the very people whose unspoken needs fueled her research. She thought of Imani's unwavering faith. This presentation wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a responsibility. The stage manager, with a cursory nod, beckoned her forward. As Eris walked towards the podium, the technician, a young man who seemed barely out of his teens, fumbled with her microphone. You sure this little clicker will work with your setup? He asked, his tone implying her equipment might be as rudimentary as her presumed credentials. Yes, it will, Eris replied, her voice calm and even, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked out at the sparsely populated room, the faces largely indifferent, some already checking their phones. This was it. She began, her voice a little tight at first, the words carefully enunciated. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and today I will be presenting research on a novel bioactive compound for accelerated tissue regeneration. The initial slides laid out the problem, the limitations of current treatments for chronic wounds, particularly in diabetic patients and the elderly. A few polite nods. Then she moved to her methodology, detailing the screening of compounds derived from a specific, traditionally used plant, a plant often dismissed by Western pharmacopoeia as having little more than anecdotal value. She presented the in vitro data, clear, compelling evidence of enhanced fibroblast proliferation and collagen synthesis. A man in the third row, who had been idly scrolling on his phone, slowly lowered it. The rustling in the room began to subside. During a brief pause she'd built in to allow for initial clarifications before diving deeper, a senior researcher, Dr. Peterson, known for his association with Dr. Finch's conservative faction, raised his hand. Dr. Thorne, he began, his voice carrying an edge of condescension, while your cellular assays are interesting, haven't similar plant-derived agents been explored extensively in the past with largely disappointing translational results? What makes your particular discovery any different? Eris met his gaze directly. Thank you for your question, Dr. Peterson. Indeed, the field is littered with broad-spectrum botanical extracts that showed initial promise in vitro but failed to translate. Our approach, however, involved isolating and purifying a single, novel triterpenoid saponin, which we've designated RX-7. Its unique stereochemistry, which we elucidated through extensive NMR and mass spectrometry, appears crucial for its targeted interaction with specific cell surface receptors, something previous, cruder extracts would have missed entirely. She clicked to a slide showing the compound's complex structure. A few more heads lifted. A younger woman in the front row, an early career fellow perhaps, began to take vigorous notes. Eris pressed on, her confidence growing with each precisely delivered fact. She moved to her preclinical data, animal models, diabetic mice with induced full-thickness dermal wounds. The images were stark. Control groups showed slow, uneven healing, often with significant scarring. The RX-7 treated groups, however, displayed astonishingly rapid wound closure, neovascularization, and organized collagen deposition, with minimal scar tissue. The room was markedly quieter now. Even from the stage, Eris could feel a subtle shift in the collective attention. She noticed Dr. Alistair Finch had slipped into the back of the room, standing near the doorway, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He wasn't smirking, but he wasn't nodding either. His presence was a cold weight. Internally, a familiar flicker of doubt assailed her, the imposter syndrome that had been a lifelong companion. Was the data too clean? Had she, in her eagerness, overlooked a confounding variable? She mentally retraced her steps, the years of meticulous experimentation, the double-blind protocols, the rigorous statistical analyses. No, the work was solid. She took a deliberate, calming breath, picturing the face of Mrs. Henderson from the clinic, whose diabetic foot ulcer had resisted every conventional treatment for months. This was for her, and for countless others like her. Eris then unveiled the core of her discovery, the mechanism of action. RX-7 didn't just generally stimulate cells, it selectively activated a previously underappreciated pathway involving a specific non-receptor tyrosine kinase, one that played a critical role in coordinating cellular migration and matrix remodeling during tissue repair. Her slides illustrated this with elegant clarity, pathway diagrams, kinase activity assays, gene expression analyses. This wasn't just a new drug, it was new biology. An almost complete silence descended upon the room. Dr. Finch had moved forward slightly, now leaning against the side wall, his gaze fixed on the screen. The memory of his signature on that grant rejection letter flashed through Eris's mind, the curt dismissal of her unconventional approach. The irony was a bitter pill, but it also fueled her. She was showing them, not telling them. As she moved toward her concluding slides, discussing potential human applications and the need for clinical trials, the atmosphere was no longer one of polite indifference or veiled skepticism. It was charged with an almost electric curiosity. The presentation was reaching its zenith. The final, compelling piece of evidence was about to be laid bare, and the quiet anticipation in the room was a far cry from the dismissive whispers that had greeted her. The game-changing reveal came with her penultimate slide. Given the robust preclinical efficacy and favorable safety profile, Eris stated, her voice steady and clear, we were able to secure ethical approval for a small, investigator-initiated compassionate use study involving 10 patients with non-healing diabetic foot ulcers refractory to standard care. A gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the audience. Such early human data from an independent, modestly funded lab was almost unheard of. She presented anonymized photographic sequences, before RX-7 treatment, and then at weekly intervals. The visual evidence was stunning. Ulcers that had remained stagnant for months, even years, showed dramatic improvement. Granulation tissue forming, wound edges contracting, complete re-epithelialization in several cases within 8 weeks. She showed a brief, consented video clip. One of the patients, an elderly gentleman, wiggling toes that doctors had told him might need amputation. The room was utterly still. The front row, filled with some of the most respected names in wound healing research, was literally speechless, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and dawning comprehension. The elegance of the science, coupled with its profound human impact, was undeniable. The moderator, a renowned surgeon who had initially looked at Eris with polite skepticism, now appeared visibly moved. Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice hushed, that is truly remarkable. We will now open the floor for questions. A pregnant pause hung in the air, the silence thick with unspoken thoughts. This was the crucible. Her career, the future of RX-7, all of it balanced on the knife edge of this Q&A. Eris felt a surge of adrenaline. She'd anticipated the skepticism, the challenges, the attempts to pick apart her years of work. She had her data, her meticulously compiled supplementary materials, ready. The first hand that went up belonged to the young researcher from the front row. Dr. Thorne, fascinating work. Could you elaborate on the long-term follow-up for the compassionate use patients? Any signs of recurrence or adverse effects? Eris smiled faintly, a genuine question from a genuinely interested mind. She provided the details: stable healing, no significant adverse events reported, quality of life improvements. This positive exchange seemed to break the ice. Several more questions followed, technical but respectful, focusing on dosage, delivery mechanisms, potential for broader applications. Eris answered each one with precision and grace, her deep command of her subject evident. Then, a familiar, imposing figure rose from the side of the room. Dr. Alistair Finch. The low hum of conversation instantly ceased. Every eye turned to him. Dr. Thorne, Finch began, his tone measured, almost paternalistic, yet with an unmistakable undercurrent of challenge. Your findings are, shall we say, quite unexpected, particularly the proposed mechanism involving the SYK kinase pathway and dermal regeneration. My own laboratory explored related pathways some years ago and found them to be largely unproductive in this context. Could you address the specific controls you employed to rule out off-target effects or synergistic activation with endogenous growth factors that might better explain these rather dramatic results? This was it. The veiled attempt to diminish her discovery, to frame it as either a fluke or an echo of his own past, less successful endeavors. Eris felt a momentary tightening in her chest, the ghosts of past dismissal swirling. But then, clarity. She remembered Imani's fierce belief, her grandmother's quiet wisdom about nature's intricate solutions. She met Finch's gaze without flinching. "Thank you, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice calm, projecting a quiet authority. Indeed, the SYK pathway's role in dermal fibroblasts has been historically underappreciated. Our supplementary data, specifically figures 12A through 12C, detail extensive SERNA knockdown experiments in the use of highly selective SYK inhibitors, which completely abrogated the pro-regenerative effects of RX-7, confirming its on-target activity. Furthermore, our phosphoproteomic analysis, detailed on slide 42, definitively shows direct phosphorylation of SYK by RX-7 engagement with its putative receptor, independent of upstream growth factor signaling. A nuance perhaps not explored in earlier work. She paused, then added, with a hint of perfectly controlled directness, "The conventional understanding, as you know, is always evolving with new evidence." A stunned silence followed. Finch, for the first time Eris had ever witnessed, looked momentarily nonplussed. His attempt to assert dominance had been met not with deference or defensiveness, but with irrefutable, superior data, delivered with unimpeachable professionalism. He mumbled something about needing to examine the supplementary materials more closely and slowly sat down, his face a mask of consternation. It was a decisive moment. The tide hadn't just turned, it had become a tsunami. The remaining questions were enthusiastic, collaborative, focused on the future. The atmosphere in the room crackled with excitement. People were already pulling out their phones, tapping out messages. Eris Thorne hadn't just presented data, she had shifted a paradigm. As the moderator called an end to the session, a wave of applause, spontaneous and sustained, filled the room. It was a sound Eris had never expected to hear directed at her in such a forum. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the tension slowly ebbing away, replaced by a profound, bone-deep relief. As she stepped down from the podium, Imani was there, eyes shining with unshed tears, practically vibrating with excitement. "You did it, Dr. Thorne. You actually did it." Imani threw her arms around Eris in a jubilant hug, a rare breach of their usual professional decorum that felt entirely right. The conference chair, a distinguished elderly physician who had initially seemed preoccupied, hurried over, his expression one of awe. "Dr. Thorne, that was extraordinary. Simply extraordinary. We must schedule a broader plenary debrief on this. Your work is groundbreaking." Other researchers, prominent figures whose papers Eris had cited for years, crowded around, hands outstretched, offering congratulations, asking for her card, already suggesting collaborations. Dr. Finch was conspicuously absent from the admiring group. A woman in a sharp suit, representing a major pharmaceutical firm, pressed her card into Eris's hand. "Dr. Thorne, my company would be very interested in discussing development pathways. Please call me." Eris felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of validation that was both exhilarating and humbling. The road ahead would undoubtedly present new challenges, new pressures of expectation, but it was a road she had paved herself, with her intellect, her perseverance, and her unwavering commitment to the truth her science had revealed. Later that evening, standing by the window of her modest hotel room, a cup of tea warming her hands, Eris looked out at the sprawling, indifferent lights of the city. She caught her reflection in the glass, no longer a footnote, no longer an overlooked anomaly, but a scientist whose voice, finally, had been heard, loud and clear. She thought of her grandmother's gentle hands and sage advice, the bedrock of her inspiration. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered to the quiet room. Imani's earlier words resonated. "You showed them, Dr. Thorne. You showed everyone." And as she considered the immense task of translating this discovery into tangible patient benefit, Eris knew she couldn't do it alone. She'd call Imani first thing in the morning. "We're going to need to expand the team, Imani," she'd say. "A much bigger team. Are you ready for what comes next? A new sense of purpose, vast and invigorating, settled within her. The real work, in many ways, was just beginning. But today, in a room once filled with doubt, truth had found its undeniable voice. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.